Well, we begin with an update from Washington, D.C., where the Securities and Exchange Commission is considering some new climate disclosure rules for publicly traded companies that could also have an impact on farmers and ranchers. Here to tell us more about this issue is Mary Thomas Hart, Environmental Counsel for the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. And Mary Thomas, what is this new rule that the SEC is considering?
The Securities and Exchange Commission is the agency that's designed to regulate publicly traded companies and their significant shareholders. But now the SEC is trying to expand their authority, what we would argue is beyond their constitutional limit, beyond those publicly traded entities to small businesses and even farmers and ranchers who sell products to publicly traded companies. And this rule would require publicly traded entities to report their Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions. Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions are supply chain emissions. Requiring those supply chain emissions to be reported to the federal government is a significant expansion of the SEC's statutory authority.
Now, with that said, what could this mean for beef producers?
Any cattle producer whose cattle are processed by a large meat packer or whose beef eventually end up being sold by a publicly traded retail entity could be impacted by this rule. And I think one of the biggest concerns is that there's a lot of uncertainty around this rule. The SEC certainly hasn't considered how this rule is going to impact farmers and ranchers. So there's a real lack of clarification around how significantly farmers and ranchers could be impacted. And I think it's so important to keep in mind that the reason, or one of the main reasons, farmers and ranchers don't currently have to report emissions to the federal or state government is because there is no way to accurately measure emissions from farms.
Mary Thomas, could this rule put our farmers and ranchers at risk legally?
There's certainly a risk. And like I said earlier, one of the biggest issues with this proposal is that the SEC hasn't provided a lot of clarity to the supply chain, including farmers and ranchers. So there's certainly a risk for farmers and ranchers to be at risk of shareholder derivative suits or suits from publicly traded companies if they fail to accurately report emissions data.
So what are the next steps then?
So the SEC is accepting comments through June 17th. NCBA and other agricultural organizations will plan to submit comments asking that SEC limit their reporting requirements to Scope 1 and Scope 2 only. So eliminate the need to submit Scope 3 emissions. If we are unable to achieve that, we would request that the SEC require Scope 3 emissions that only come from publicly available data like EPA's greenhouse gas emissions inventory or USDA's life cycle assessment, so that farmers and ranchers aren't required to submit more data to publicly traded entities in the federal government.
And finally, how can members of the beef industry help?
It's clear that the SEC is an agency designed to regulate Wall Street, not Main Street. And we want to make sure that through this comment period, we send that message clearly to the federal government. And we need cattle producers to help send that message. NCBA will submit comments, but we need cattle producers to submit comments as well. To submit comments, you can go to policy.ncba.org and sign our letter to the SEC. Comments are due on June 17th, 2022.
Now, as Mary Thomas just mentioned, NCBA has created a very easy way for you to let the Securities and Exchange Commission know what you think about their proposed rule on reporting greenhouse gas emissions. Just go to policy.ncba.org to send a message directly to the SEC. Your chance to sign the letter ends on June 17th, so please take a minute and do it today to help make sure your voice is heard on this very important rule.